Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Centre for Philosophy's Speaker Seminar Series. I am your host, Associate Professor M. Dentith, and I have the great pleasure today to introduce you to our latest speaker, Justine Kingsbury from the University of Waikato. Justine and I go back quite a long time, and that Justine was actually a supervisor on my PhD. So Justine and I have a long and storied history, and it's a great pleasure to introduce you to her today. So Justine, as I said, works at the University of Waikato. She's one of those philosophers who has a lot of wide-ranging research interests. She currently has two research projects that she's working on, one of which is on intercultural understanding, and the other one is on the philosophy of Ruth Millikan. Today, she is giving a talk entitled Some Risks in Attempting to Understand Cultures That Are Not Our Own and Why We Should Try Anyway. And once Justine has given that talk, we're going to have a reply from the University of Auckland's Balamohan Shingade, who will be replying to Justine's talk after Justine has given her presentation. So without any further ado, Justine, please take it away.
Thank you, Em. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. A further connection is that the university where I supervised Em long ago was the University of Auckland, and Balamohan is a current PhD student at the University of Auckland. Okay. So it's difficult to achieve understanding across a cultural divide and probably impossible to achieve complete understanding. But I'm going to suggest that it's better to try to understand than to resort to a kind of disengaged mere tolerance of the views of other cultures. Here I'm going to discuss some of my recent work in this area and some of the problems with it that have been identified by commentators on that work and how I'm kind of responding to those. One major issue is the need to avoid distorting the cultural practices that you're talking about in the process of trying to make them accessible to outsiders. And another related issue is the need for epistemic humility. My work on this has focused on a particular pair of cultures, Maori culture and the Western or Anglo culture that's dominant in New Zealand. And I've also focused on a particular aspect or component of the Maori worldview, the taniwha, which I'll be telling you about shortly. I'm going to be talking about this here today as a kind of a case study. However, I think the conclusions that I draw about the risks and rewards of attempts at intercultural engagement might be fairly generally applicable. However, I'm hoping that you, an international audience familiar with cultures other than the ones that I'm familiar with, will be able to help me with this. Hopefully Balamohan will, and in the question time, the audience will as well. I'm currently failing to manage to move to the next slide. Why is that?
Maybe try stopping the share and starting the share again.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. I might share a different version of this. Hang on. Can you now see my slides, although not in not in full screen view?
We can, yes.
Okay, let's just go with that.
At the moment, it's still stuck on the first slide.
Yeah, yep, good, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. These are the bibliographical details of an exchange between me and Carl Mika, who is a philosopher at the University of Canterbury. So I wrote a paper called Taking Taniwha Seriously, which I'm going to be talking about here. And Carl responded to it, and now I'm in the process of responding to his response. So this is the case study which I'm talking about here, the Taniwha case study. Slight problem with my slides. Okay, so a taniwha in Maori culture, Te Ao Maori, the Maori worldview, is a water being that may be a guardian of humans or maybe a danger to them, or both. Children are sometimes threatened with the taniwha. So if you want to stop your children playing at a dangerous bend in the river, you tell them about the taniwha that lives on that bend. That taniwha is both a threat, a danger, but also a guardian in the sense that they are preventing the harm to the children by preventing the children from swimming in at that bend of the river. In Maori pūrākau or traditional narratives, there's a running sort of theme of taniwha as protectors while also being immensely powerful water beings who are dangerous. Now, in New Zealand and Aotearoa, when there are kind of public works proposed, like building new roads, building tunnels, it's necessary under the Treaty of Waitangi, which is our kind of founding document, to consult with iwi, with Maori groups about what's being done, where it's being done, what issues there may be about building in this area. And one of the things that come up in these consultations are taniwha. So a taniwha might dwell in an area which a proposed road is running through, and that may be a reason not to proceed or to change the path of the road. So taniwha then kind of are in the news occasionally because they make a difference to public works. So here are a couple of examples from quite long ago. In 2002, there was a proposal to reroute our main road, State Highway 1, at a particular spot, Mary, and consultation with the local iwi, the local tribe, revealed that the proposed road was going to pass through a swamp, which was where the taniwha Karutahi lived. And so this halted construction for a period while there was consultation, and then the road was rerouted to avoid the spot. And you can see here some of the headlines in the New Zealand Herald: taniwha halts work on highway, transit in the taniwha, and the BBC ran a piece called that was headed "Maori Swamp Monster Delays Road." I'm using this as evidence of a kind of slightly mocking attitude, perhaps, towards taniwha and towards the way in which taniwha play a role in New Zealand life. A further example, in 2011, over the taniwha Horatiu and the proposed Auckland rail loop, we get this kind of media coverage. One commentator said, those who try to stop or delay a project by complaining that a taniwha is in the route probably will drop their objections in return for monetary settlement. I can't think of too many other reasons someone would claim a taniwha lives in the way of a road or rail route. This commentator is claiming that the iwi, the Maori tribe, are being disingenuous in claiming that there is a taniwha in the way, that they don't really believe in it. It's just they're just kind of using it as a way to get a financial settlement. And then from the more reputable New Zealand Herald, an editorial, taniwha are everywhere. These mythical creatures of Māori legend haunt the natural landscape, to be summoned forth by any believer who wants to frighten mere mortals planning to tamper with nature. Again, suggesting that the tribe in question don't believe, or that Māori in general don't really believe in taniwha. Rather, they're just kind of being obstructive, or trying to exert control, rather than genuinely making kind of principled statements about where the taniwha is and why, if the taniwha is there, the road or the tunnel or whatever should not be there. And one more, Prime Minister John Key, then Prime Minister John Key, was asked in a Stuff interview, again regarding the Auckland Rail Loop, whether he believed in the Māori spiritual creature. And he said, I've got to say, not overly, no, I respect people's spiritual beliefs, but I'm not a great believer in them. I take that to be, I mean, charitably, I think that John Key is trying. He's prepared to respect the fact that that iwi believe in something, and that's a reason to change what we do. But he's certainly not taking their beliefs seriously. He's not even entertaining the possibility that they might be true. So then, has there been a change in attitudes in Aotearoa, New Zealand, since then? Well, I think that there has. So this is more than 10 years ago now. In the last few years, there has been much more public use of Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, much more of a push for both Māori and Pākehā, non-Māori, to learn the Māori language, and much more reporting in pretty mainstream locations, positive reporting of matters to do with Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, or the Māori worldview. So I think that there is a shift, and there is a will amongst Pākehā and non-Māori to change their attitude to non-Māori, but it's not straightforward. So my question here at the bottom of the slide, even if they want to, how can tauiwi, again, non-Māori, take taniwha more seriously? Because the distance between the prevailing Western scientific worldview and Te Ao Māori is very great. How can we even begin to take seriously the thought that there might be spiritual water creatures who actually kind of live in the rivers and in the swamps, and whose being there genuinely should make a difference to how we treat those habitats or those environments? There seems to be quite a gulf between these worldviews. And so what I was trying to do in my paper, Taking Taniwha Seriously, was propose a way that we might come to take taniwha more seriously. And this is just a single case. I suppose that what's true of taniwha is to some extent also going to be true of other features of the Māori worldview and how we might come to think about them. And I think probably this case generalizes to some extent to other cases of intercultural understanding, or attempts at intercultural understanding as well. So Dan Hikaroa is an earth scientist at the University of Auckland, and he writes about taniwha, and he presents them as a kind of a taniwha pūrākau, taniwha stories are practical things. They serve to reduce disaster risk because they warn us about things like where to build. So in a way, there's information about past disasters like floods and earthquakes encoded in taniwha stories, and paying attention to those stories and kind of thinking about them when we're deciding where to put the roads or where to site our cities or whatever, paying attention to taniwha pūrākau can help us in this very practical way in those contexts. So the thought is that these stories, these pūrākau, they're not just stories, they're a way of passing on information about natural hazards, natural disasters from generation to generation. and they are still useful to us today. There's a case, a town on the east coast of the North Island of New Zealand, Matata, which was very badly damaged by floods, and but the marae, the Maori villages, they were not destroyed by these floods, even though kind of large parts of the town were wiped out. And the reason they were not is that the reason they were placed where they were placed was because of what the Taniwha Pūrākau said about the local Taniwha and the swishing tail of the local Taniwha. The swishing tail of the Taniwha seems to be at least analogous to or a representation of the changing path of the local river and under flood conditions. And so the swishing tail of the Taniwha, I mean, maybe it just is the changing path of the river, and paying attention to that fact and putting your village where it's not going to be damaged by the swishing tail of the Taniwha, thus serves to protect the village in the event of the river flooding. Okay, so this is Dan Hikaroa's view of what Taniwha Pūrākau are for, or at least part of what they're for. They are for communicating information about the risk of natural disasters. So then, my aim was to use Hikaroa's view of Taniwha, that view that they are either, well, that they're indicators of flood risk, as a way to get Pākehā, Tauiwi, non-Māori to think differently about Taniwha. My thought was, well, once you start seeing that Taniwha are actually useful, that perhaps they're talking about a Taniwha just is talking about an enhanced risk of flooding or something like that. Thinking about Taniwha in that way might be a first step to kind of not being so mocking about Taniwha, thinking of them as useful, a first step which might then enable us to make further steps towards a fuller understanding of Taniwha. So, in that paper, Taking Taniwha Seriously, I gave this argument that Taniwha Pūrākau serve an ongoing practical purpose, and if that's right, then that kind of licenses regarding Taniwha as real in the same way as their scientific theories like the theory of electricity, how electricity works by the movement of electrons and so on. I mean, we can't see the electrons either, but it's useful to us to believe this theory about what's going on when we turn the light switch on. We're licensed in believing in electrons, even though we can't see them, because doing so serves a practical purpose. So that's kind of the model for thinking if Taniwha Pūrākau serve an ongoing practical purpose too, that licenses regarding Taniwha as real. And regarding Taniwha as real is perhaps a small step towards respecting the Māori worldview, and we should be trying to do that. And so, conclusion, we should, if we can, and unless we have some other attitude to Taniwha that's at least equally respectful, we should try to regard Taniwha as real. So that was my argument in the paper, Taking Taniwha Seriously. Lots to say about the argument, but I'm more interested, we can talk about this in question time if you like. At this point though, I think the more interesting thing is how commentators have responded to it. So I'm going to go on to that now. So this paper, Taking Taniwha Seriously, is in the Asian Journal of Philosophy, and it's going to be part of a symposium. So there are responses to it, including a response from Carl Mika, which is called The Problem of the Spiritual Thing. Carl's view of what I'm doing in the paper is I'm taking certain Pākehā New Zealanders, that's non-Māori New Zealanders, through some steps so that they can accept the existence of Taniwha in a way that is culturally palatable for them. Now, That may sound kind of dismissive, but actually it is exactly what I was doing. I was thinking, well, to change people's minds, you need to kind of meet them where they are. You need to think about what will appeal to them, what will make them start taking taniwha seriously. And so it's, yes, I very much was looking for a kind of a way in, a way to think about, to start thinking differently about taniwha that would be acceptable to Pākehā New Zealanders. Now, Carl Mika's response, he doesn't directly say that taniwha without spirituality, which is, I mean, I was presenting taniwha just in the way that Dan Hakaroa presents them as indicators of natural hazards, or perhaps actually as being natural hazards. So I wasn't talking about spirituality at all. Carl doesn't directly say that taniwha without spirituality are not taniwha at all, or more generally that no understanding of the Māori worldview can possibly leave out spirituality. But he does approach this point, I think, obliquely, via a discussion that picks up on part of my motivation for engaging in this project, the mockery and hostility that's seen in some Pākehā responses to talk of taniwha, and we saw some of those before, in particular the ones that suggest that Māori are being disingenuous and they're pretending to believe in taniwha. And also the ones that make it sound like just a ridiculous thing to think about, ridiculous that we're having to reroute the road because someone says that there's a taniwha in the swamp. Carl talks about kind of why people have those kinds of responses. He doesn't simply condemn those responses, he tries to understand them, and generously he's concerned with the well-being of those Pākehā, non-Māori, who respond in this way. He thinks that for their own good, Pākehā need to engage with Māori spirituality. So then why might Pākehā New Zealanders be so resistant to this? In Carl Mika's view, it's because, at least partly because, they're afraid of not being in control. Western worldviews, broadly speaking, regard humans as separate from and superior to other things in the world. And Carl says, when humanity conceives of itself as above and superior to other things in the world, a tendency to control those things establishes itself. Knowledge or understanding, he says, is a means to control. And so it's important to Westerners that everything can be understood, that nothing is fundamentally mysterious. But Carl says Te Ao Māori just is fundamentally mysterious. It's not just mysterious to Pākehā because it's foreign to us, it's mysterious in itself. Mysterious in what way? Well, Mika talks about invisible worlds or realms that humans will never be able to perceive, and suggests that everything, including taniwha and humans, shares in these realms. Consequently, he says, all things extend beyond human knowledge. On this kind of view, the mysteries are to be embraced rather than dispelled. Now, this does seem to me a quite kind of foreign sort of. Sorry, I was checking the chat, but it's all right. It's not people saying they can't hear. This is from my perspective a quite kind of foreign approach, the thought that we kind of shouldn't perhaps even be trying to understand things. I mean, find that we're not going to be able to understand everything, or that we don't understand anything yet, but the thought that we should be kind of embracing mystery, that does strike me as a bit foreign to the world, to my worldview, which is a kind of Western scientific worldview. Mika speaks of the interconnected world as a fundamental tenet of Māori existence. Humans are not separate from the natural world. The spiritual world is not separate from the material world. the kinds of things we tend to think of as non-living, mountains, rivers, they are not separate from people or plants or animals. And when we try to understand the world, we have to remember that we're part of what we are, we're part of what we're trying to understand. Now, I'm going to talk about the interconnectedness point, this point, and the mystery point. I think they're two, they raise different issues. So this point, that when we try to understand the world, we're part of what we're trying to understand. This fits very well with recentish work in Western epistemology. Standpoint epistemologists emphasize that we never have a God's eye view of the world. We're always seeing things from a particular perspective, and that perspective partly determines what we see. This is, I think, implicit in my stepwise approach to trying to change how Pākehā think about taniwha. So my thought was, if we can change our perspective on taniwha just a little bit, then our new perspective might then open up the possibility of further change. So perhaps from where I now stand, the best I can do is to start trying to think of taniwha as indicators of risk. But once I succeed in thinking of them like that, well, perhaps new ways of thinking about them may become possible for me, ways that from where I am now are completely invisible. Who knows what taniwha might look like from some future position that I haven't reached yet. So the point that we need to realize kind of our own position in the world that we're trying to understand, that I think is not a point that should seem foreign from the perspective of Western epistemology. The interconnectedness, that is something that kind of when you're dealing with the Maori worldview, you have to kind of make a genuine effort to remember, and it may be very hard to actually understand. So I can kind of say the words, the Whanganui River is a person and Mount Taranaki is a person, or but I think there is a real question about whether I genuinely understand what that means. I think we always need to be kind of thinking about whether we've actually not assumed that we have got it really. But still, the basic point here, that we are a part of the world that we're trying to understand, that's not a foreign point. But the mystery point, that seems different to me. It raises a different challenge. So whether or not it's because of a desire for control, I do want to be able to explain things, to understand them, to accumulate knowledge about them. And that I think I'm typical of my culture, and in particular the culture of Western science and analytical philosophy, but arguably of Western culture in general. So then to be able to just sort of sit with a mystery and not treat it as a puzzle to be solved, not worry about it, just let it be, that is something that doesn't come naturally, I think, to the likes of me, but it seems like something to try for. Karl Mika diagnoses the antagonism of some Pākehā towards Maori spirituality as resulting from what he calls rangirua, a kind of spiritual disconnection, which goes along with a fear of not having control of things. He speaks of the deep cultural oblivion, this is a quote, that comes with adamantly dismissing out of hand the possibility that there are other spiritual realms that entangle with this one. To deny the possibility of other realms is to fragment oneself from the all. I think, well, he's saying it would be better if people were less adamant about their beliefs, were more open to a wider range of possibilities. Better, he thinks, for the individuals in question as well as for society at large. As well as trying to be willing to let a mystery remain a mystery, in order to open yourself up to a wider range of possibilities, it may be necessary to try to entertain a collection of views that don't all cohere particularly well with each other, without feeling that you have to make a choice, or at least without rushing to close any of them down. Cognitive dissonance is usually considered to be a negative thing, a feeling of discomfort associated with conflicting beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours. But perhaps we can learn or try not to be discomforted by such conflicts. Alternatively, perhaps we can even try to embrace our discomfort. It might be good for us to have our certainties disrupted, Thinking it's possible to have a single coherent worldview is a sign of membership of the dominant culture. Presumably all Maori now alive have always had to deal with the uncomfortable juxtaposition of Te Ao Pakeha, the Western world, and Te Ao Māori, the Maori world. So I think now maybe it's clearer why my suggested strategy of trying to change Pākehā minds about taniwha and also kind of more generally about Te Ao Māori might be a mistake. It's a very gentle strategy. It considers where Pākehā are now, and it bends over backwards not to make them uncomfortable. It doesn't talk about spirituality, deferring that until hopefully there's been enough of a change of attitude for talk about spirituality to be more palatable than it is now. It kind of packages certain aspects of Te Ao Māori for Pākehā consumption. So I was trying to get people to take taniwha seriously by avoiding mentioning that taniwha are spiritual beings. I did think of that as only a first step that might then make a further move possible towards a deeper understanding. The worry is, I guess, it might not even be a step in the right direction. So if taniwha just are essentially spiritual beings, if you can't talk about them at all without talking about them as spiritual beings, then getting people to think about them as natural hazards or as indicators of natural hazards might not be helpful. Okay. A further problem perhaps is that if we kind of succeeded, if I succeeded in thinking about taniwha as indicators of risk or and also getting other people to think about them this way, you might find some might think of this as kind of endpoint. Now we understand taniwha, now we understand Te Ao Māori, rather than as a step on the way to a broader and deeper understanding that does acknowledge Maori spirituality. So the move might be counterproductive if it leads to a kind of smug sense that we've now achieved understanding. We don't need to go any further with this. Okay, so new thoughts in response to Carl Mika's commentary. The kind of gradual stepwise process I was trying to take my Pākehā readers through to get them to think differently about taniwha perhaps is not the right approach. So what might we do then? One possibility is that this is not a stepwise kind of thing. You kind of, I was supposing you make a small move in your attitude to taniwha and that makes a bigger move possible later on. Eventually you get, well, you may never get there, you probably do never get to complete understanding, but at least perhaps you get closer and closer. But perhaps it isn't a stepwise kind of thing. Perhaps instead what's needed for understanding is a kind of epiphany, a sudden transformative experience. Then the question is, how do you put yourself in the way of having that kind of experience? How do you, if you want to come to understand, how do you set up the conditions for that? Another possible response is, well, maybe it is stepwise, but the steps that are needed are not the steps I was thinking, kind of trying to start from where the Pākehā is and the Pākehā who wants to learn, trying to approach them at the point at which they are and take them through gradual steps by thinking about taniwha as analogous to a scientific posit or whatever. Perhaps those are the wrong steps to take. And one possibility is that instead trying to dive into Te Ao Māori, trying to take up whatever opportunities are available to you to learn about the culture that you're trying to understand. Perhaps that's actually the way to gradually change your viewpoint. So then I now suppose that whether or not I think of it as the kind of change I'm talking about is something that you achieve in a kind of sudden way, an epiphany, or whether you think of it as a different kind of stepwise process to the one I was originally suggesting. Either way, these seem like some things to do to try and do better. So I take it that Carl Meeker's fairly gentle critique is suggesting that I was not sufficiently, I hadn't tried sufficiently hard, I hadn't got far enough with just trying to find out about Te Ao Māori, kind of hear what Māori tell us about Te Ao Māori. So here are some suggestions, some ways to avoid those mistakes. Take up any opportunities that come your way to learn in a hands-on kind of way about the culture that you're trying to understand. Learn the language. So different languages just do bring with them different ways of seeing the world. And I think learning the language of the culture you're trying to understand is a good step towards understanding. Don't just read about the culture that you're trying to understand. It's important to learn by doing, and then by thinking about what you're doing rather than just by reading. So in this case, so I can, so my university is making courses available for staff to try and kind of upskill them in Te Ao Māori, teach them about tikanga, kind of the right way of doing things in the Māori world. And you learn kind of how a welcome goes. You participate in the kinds of ceremonies that are used when you're welcoming someone onto your marae, onto your home patch, and you when you're greeting people, there's a particular way of a particular order in which you explain who you are and where you're from, which doesn't, I can talk about this more in the question time if you like, but I've got a lot to say about the ways in which the Māori introduction of oneself is quite different from what we would normally do when introducing ourselves in a Western context. So do the things and think about what you're doing. That's a good way to learn. Don't start out assuming that you know anything about the purposes of the practices that you're engaging in and learning about. You could be completely mistaken. And seek advice or find people to talk to about what you're doing, but with the caveat that it's important not to impose on them and think that you have a right to their help. The particular context in which I'm in is one in which there are not very many Māori philosophers and they have a lot of demands on their time. And so helping me to get to grips with Te Ao Māori or to advise other people about how to get to grips with Te Ao Māori, that is not and should not be highest priority for them. And so it's important kind of not to assume that people owe you their help, and to find ways of kind of getting into discussion about these things that are mutually beneficial. Now, I said I was going to talk about why we should try to understand other cultures. And I haven't really said very much about that. What I've been talking about is kind of ways of getting to understand other cultures and things to look out for, problems, pitfalls to avoid. I'd quite like some help from my audience about this, because I think it's just so obvious we should be trying to understand other cultures that I have difficulty arguing for it. I guess the alternate view, which I have had expressed to me, is, well, it doesn't matter whether we understand or not, provided we're tolerant of other cultures, provided we kind of acknowledge that other people have different views and different practices, and we allow them space to have different views and practices, then that's just as good as genuinely trying to understand. In the New Zealand context, you might think we've got a kind of built-in substitute for understanding in a way, because we are required, or our we're legally required to engage in a kind of consultation in lots of different contexts, including the public works context that I was talking about earlier. Under the Treaty of Waitangi, we must consult iwi about a whole range of things. And you might think, well, then since if we do this, if we do consult and we do act on the results of our consultation, then why isn't that just as good as trying to understand? I don't really have an argument for this. I just have the thought that if you just kind of think in the kind of way suggested on the John Key slide earlier, that it's fine that other people have these beliefs. I don't believe them. I don't even see how I could believe them. But that's fine. They can believe what they believe, and we will kind of make sure we kind of act on things like the presence of a taniwha, because we have to care about what these people care about, and they care about this. Then that's so okay. That's what I mean by a kind of disengaged tolerance. My thought is that that doesn't run very deep. That being able to imagine what it would be like to believe a thing, or even to find a way to come to believe it yourself, is going to lead to a more resiliently respectful bicultural or multicultural society. That intercultural genuine understanding, or genuine kind of attempts to understand as well as you can, are more respectful than the disengaged tolerance that someone might otherwise think in a kind of cultural relativist way is the right way to react. I realise that I have not really given much of an argument here, but I guess I also do think that if trying to kind of seriously undertake to kind of see what it would be like to have the beliefs that the other culture has, and possibly even to come to have them yourself, that will kind of, that if that was sort of normalized, then you wouldn't get the kind of dismissiveness that we saw in some of those slides earlier, and that would be a good thing. That dismissiveness would become less socially acceptable. Finally, how much does any of this generalize to other intercultural contexts? I only know about this context, the context in which so New Zealand was colonized by Westerners. Now we have Te Ao Māori, a culture which was kind of swept away in a way. I mean, it survived, but there was quite a lot of attempt to simply get rid of it. It survived, and now we have the question, kind of how do these two cultures now interact? How can we treasure this culture, Māori culture, and how can we come to understand it better? I think that in this context, the New Zealand context, I think there's a very pressing reason to try. It's a colonial context. There's a history that needs to be kind of redressed. But I think that much of this actually probably applies in other contexts as well, in which people are trying to achieve understanding across cultural boundaries. So there's, if you have a different world with problems about achieving understanding across differences of worldview, are well known. There's a whole literature not starting probably, but including Wittgenstein, about kind of why this can't really be done. And so I think there's a challenge there for anyone who's trying to understand other cultures, to kind of try and find ways of doing it, even if it can't be done completely as well as it can. But as I said, I have only a very narrow range of experience of this issue in the New Zealand context. So I'm hoping that either my commentator Balamohan or the rest of you, the audience, may be able to bring your wider range of experience to bear on helping me with this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Now, before we move on to the question time, we have a response by Balamohan, who is from the University of Auckland. He is a PhD student there, and I believe he's going to give comments now on what Justine has said. So, Balamohan, please take it away.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much. Warm greetings to you from Tamaki Makaurau. I'll just check that you can hear me okay.
We can.
Very good. Thank you. Such a privilege to respond to you, Dr. Justine Kingsbury. Thank you, Em and Justine, for the invitation and for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to leave room for a few questions after offering reflections, because I have a few and I'm sure the audience will too. But my comments are to join Justine's efforts as among the scholars from Aotearoa not immersed in Te Ao Māori to find ways of relating justly to the fact of Indigenous difference. And I agree with Dr. Kingsbury that for the prospect of Indigenous and settler relations, more is asked of non-Indigenous peoples than tolerance. I think it's neither tenable nor innocent to say that we settlers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, simply have no idea about the Māori worldview, that we don't know or understand what our Indigenous interlocutors mean. I think it's easy, or at least easier, to intuit how playing ostrich, burying your head in the sand, perpetuates the dominance of Western frameworks. It's harder actually to understand how well-intentioned intercultural epistemic and hermeneutical engagements go wrong. The case described by Justine focusing on Taniwha, particularly the dismissive attitudes towards Taniwha on the part of non-Māori, I think provides a salient example of a dialogical interface across Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview. But the case gives us more than this. It's an example of a wrong to tangata whenua, that is, the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, in their capacities as knowers. This case illustrates the practices of interpretation and understanding across Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview are asymmetrical, and that they take place across a backdrop of asymmetrical power relations across Indigenous and settler groups. I've been interested to learn from Dr. Kingsbury's reflections, particularly today on her responses to criticisms she's received from Māori philosophers and colleagues, particularly on the risks of distorting the culture in question in trying to make them accessible to outsiders. Philosopher Carl Mika makes this point obliquely, as Kingsbury notes, and elsewhere, Māori philosopher Krishil Watene suggests that perhaps too much of the Taniwha is left out. Watene writes, Kingsbury merely offers us a way of taking some aspects of Taniwha seriously. So I wondered, and perhaps this was one of my first questions, whether the overall trajectory of the what of Te Ao Māori, that is, how to make sense of and take such non-human entities as Taniwha seriously, whether the trajectory is changing from the what to the how and why of inter and cross-cultural engagement. So in other words, I wonder if the earlier epistemic-focused work on the belief of Taniwha's existence, whether it's through a stepwise approach or through an epiphany, whether that as a central goal is changing to now a hermeneutic-focused goal of interpretation and understanding as the focus of the project. So I'll offer a few reflections by picking up on a part of the motivation for engaging in this project. And I think this is a point that Carl Mika picks up on too. That is, where does the will to interpret come from? Specifically, interpretation with the possibility of making one culture's sense and meaning understood from across or within other frameworks. On my reading, and I wonder what your response would be, Justine, the project begins with the witnessing of disrespect, of a wrong done to Indigenous peoples in the narratives of mockery and ridicule that you recount. An epistemic form of injustice due to the settler colonial context, we might say. So the reason we should try to engage in cross-cultural understanding, despite the risks in attempting to understand cultures that are not our own, is because of just relations of justice between indigenous and settler peoples are seeming to be undermined at the epistemic or hermeneutical level. For me, at least, this is where the will to interpret comes from, a will that is shaped by witnessing of wrongs. And this is what, to my mind, makes it quite a different type of a hermeneutic project to other types of very challenging hermeneutic projects. For example, say, distant voices from within one's own culture or other cultures, like the reading of ancient Indian or Chinese texts and the interpretation and understanding of them from 3,000 years ago. So, although non-understanding or impartial understanding seems not a unique problem, what makes this urgent in the cases that we're examining is that there's a witnessing of a wrong done to someone or some group, and that it has a bearing actually on the way that people's lives go. So Kingsbury's work draws our attention to how the epistemic and the social are intertwined in quite complicated ways. So the coming few comments focus on this part, because I think this is where we might find the applicability of this inquiry to other contexts by attending to this point. So if the main insight I draw from Justine's work has to do with the intertwining of the social political dimension with the epistemic dimension, then this is also where I'm hoping for some more clarity. Because the motivational force for this work comes from the social dimension, that is, relations across indigenous settler groups. So there's the two focuses, on the one hand, the epistemic hermeneutical, on the other hand, the social political. And I'll try to organize some comments by taking each one in turn. So with the Taniwha example, looking now at the epistemic and hermeneutic part, Kingsbury shows that for those of us in Aotearoa not immersed in Te Ao Māori, our dominant settler frameworks, and I think this idea is important, that they're dominant, the white, Western, scientifically underwritten to kind of capture it, but of course not very well. But the dominant settler frameworks will often receive indigenous ideas as incongruous, uninterpretable. We receive these ideas in intercultural dialogue and in social interaction as speeches of resistance in politics, as cultural narratives and retellings, or as artworks. And situated as we are outside of indigenous frameworks, we're without the philosophical inheritances and orientations to take up, let alone dwell in indigenous modes of reasoning and relating. Here, what the response of Carl Meekers is, I think, is very interesting. As a Māori philosopher, what he seems to do is diagnose a malaise among non-indigenous settlers. He describes a condition that settlers are seen to suffer from, rangirua. And in his response, in his diagnosis, I can't help but see how in these indigenous settler relations, in hermeneutical practices specifically across our kinds of groups, across Te Ao Māori and the worldview, tangata whenua, that is, indigenous peoples, might always have had to make genuine efforts, or efforts of a particular kind, at interpretation and understanding, whereas dominantly placed situators a risk, and as you note, the distortion of indigenous knowledges. So Mika's diagnosis alerts us to the fact that perhaps dominant discourses have pieced together things in a dysfunctional way. Not only that we might perceive the indigenous knowledges in a way that's distorted, but actually that our perception itself from the dominant point of view, despite the testimony of our indigenous interlocutors, might itself be dysfunctional. I think this point of rangirua is really interesting. The gaps in our conceptual resources or the background presuppositions risk not only the testimony, but also the sense perception of the world itself. This is some of what I seem to be hearing from Mika's diagnosis. And if this is the case, then we must ask, I think, what the dominant frameworks require on the basis of Maori testimony. So there's an argument to be made that a form of non-accidental reading. Let me try that again. There's an asymmetry in our epistemic and hermeneutical practices. That much we have covered. And the fact that this reinforces the effect of injustice, of which is epistemic in kind. So if hermeneutical and epistemic practices are asymmetrically motivated in the settler colonial context, such that indigenous people will generally have a fluency with Western frameworks as compared with settlers who will not in the same way be engaged in indigenous frameworks, then the question arises, well, what perceptions of social reality might be possible based on Maori testimony? So let me clear an ambiguity. Am I discussing here indigenous peoples and settler groups' engagement with each other's culturally specific epistemology? Or am I discussing the veridical perceptions of social reality? And I think insofar as the asymmetry is concerned, it's perhaps both. So what's of concern in this context for us is the erasure of indigenous difference by subsuming it under the framework of the dominant discourse. And here, including how indigenous knowledge is oriented to the world and constructs its knowledge as knowledge. And insofar as we might have gaps in our dominant discourse, it seems to me that it's not a matter of filling it in and sketching it out, but rather to fall through it, to fall through our hermeneutic gaps, to see the epistemic horizons of the indigenous knowers and knowledge holders. Fundamentally, we might be dealing with an invitation to see the world differently. The ideas here that Dr. Kingsbury referred to of discomfort, of being uncomfortable, and of unsettling, I think are to be read as very good and positive things. Because in the stepwise sort of approach, the idea of inviting discomfort and unsettling is precisely what seems to be required of dominant frameworks based on Maori testimony. So this idea is to bolster that way forward, which suggests that the discomfort is perhaps even a necessary thing for a way forward. So perhaps the focus on Matauranga, Purako, Kaupapa instead shifts to ask, well, how do we rethink Western frameworks on the basis of our indigenous settler relations oriented to just relations, given that our motivation comes from a witnessing of a wrong? So that's the hermeneutical epistemic part. And the second part, reflecting on social and political, I want to think about, well, these practices are aimed, and who's it for? And I want to make a few comments, basically with an analogy. So imagine a new migrant settler to Aotearoa, New Zealand. Her non-recognition and non-comprehension of the taniwha at the time of her arrival is no cause in and of itself for an appeal to a wrongdoing. So we wouldn't call it an injustice if she didn't know about the taniwha or if they couldn't comprehend its reality. All the while, the taniwha continues to exist independently of her doxastic attitudes, even though its influence on the settler's life is minimal at this stage. But as the knowledge of taniwha on the basis of Maori testimony mingles with the settler's way of being and relating with others, then the questions of wrongs, the questions of justice and injustice seem possible to ask. So, to my mind, the social political part might help us to know how much of this is generalizable beyond the context of Aotearoa, New Zealand. what seems specific to our context, and perhaps also Australia, North America, is a settler colonial context underwriting our epistemic and hermeneutical practices. So perhaps to say a little bit about the settler colonial context, borrowing from Patrick Wolf, it's the logic of elimination, not as a historical event, but as a perpetual system of unequal power relations resulting in the marginalizing of indigenous peoples and cultures for the maintenance of the dominant West. So in present-day Aotearoa, the logic of elimination seems to be, we could say, perpetuated at the epistemic level as erasure of indigenous ways of knowing and relating. It includes the erasure of community voice and agency, and is perpetuated by the Eurocentrism of settlers, including settlers of color. So the idea here around settler colonial context is that settlers draw upon the values of the West to legitimize ideas, justify narratives, uphold beliefs, and simultaneously devalue or miscognize indigenous forms, which form the basis of the erasure, including how the knowledge orients itself as knowledge. Now, the thought around the study's applicability to other contexts, I wonder whether much of it depends on its connection with our earlier point around where the motivation for doing the study comes from, which is the witnessing of a wrong, situated in an analysis of power. So it takes me to the opening note of noticing the disrespect or noticing the tone of ridicule and mockery, which sort of motivates this project. And we might think here about how a dominance is perpetuated and is the status quo is seen as inevitable and necessary, rather than as a social construct primarily for the benefit of settlers. I want to go to, by way of wrapping up in some ways, I want to go to another cultural context of which I'm most familiar with, which is the Indian context and the Indian diaspora context. Because I think this might help land the point around the importance of just relations undermined by epistemic and hermeneutical level. So, and also I think of how power is so important, it seems, to make sense of when a narrative ought to be heard in what sort of a key. So let me try this out and see how we go. I'd be interested to think with you all. The key problem here that I want to think through is how a decolonial logics of cultural revivalism and respect of ancient traditions is actually perpetuated and appealed to by the powerful group in the Indian context and in the Indian diaspora. So the most salient present day example is that of a Hindu nationalism, which is a political ideology based on the construction of India as a supposed Hindu nation state, built on the logic of a cultural essence going back to 3,000 years, or at least to the Vedas. And this, in many ways, to undermine the secular, pluralistic, and syncretic foundations of the Indian constitution. Without going into too much of the details, what I want to note is that similar types of values of decolonization are mobilized in the Hindu nationalist context to produce an other, a set of groups regarded as invaders or internal threats to the so-called idealized Hindu Rashtra. So the narrative constructions of Hindu ideology portray a cultural essence, portray cultural revivalism, a respect for ancient traditions and oral narratives, in order to form an image of a Hindu struggle against foreign invaders, which has continued and which is continuous at the epistemic level for millennia and supposedly continues today. However, these narratives are articulated by the powerful group. They're articulated by a group who's, according to Genocide Watch, who are performing a risk of a genocide of the minority populations in the Indian context. So across the Indian diaspora too, the idea of a Hindu victim under continual threat is elaborated to portray Hindus as survivors of colonialism and righteous revivers of ancient civilization. So to return to the initial point, which is that if witnessing a wrong or disrespect is the motivation, and if the social and political on the one hand and epistemic and hermeneutical on the other are intertwined in complicated ways, then I wonder how our intercultural efforts at understanding might be situated in such an analysis of power and control. So the question then becomes, where do we go from here? Well, I think some of it you have suggested, which is that has implications at the epistemic level. I wonder whether epistemic solidarity is a term and whether we ought to think about it. Another way to think is future-oriented justice and what we required at the epistemic level. So I'll wrap up there, but there seem to be throughout a few different questions. I wonder if any you wanted to respond to, think through with me, and then we can open it up to questions as well. But thank you so much for inviting me to share some reflections and for the privilege of hearing you speak and speaking alongside you.
Thank you, Balamohan. Justine, do you have any initial response you want to make before we open things up to Q&A? You might need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you.
You can respond without the microphone, it just won't be as informative.
Thank you. I just mostly like to thank Balamohan for his commentary. That's very helpful and lots to think about there. I do have some things to talk about, but I think perhaps first let's throw the questions open to the floor and see if other people want to contribute.
Okay, so if people want to ask questions, I think the best option is to use the raise the hand function. So if you go down to reactions, which is at the very bottom of the Zoom screen, you click on reactions, there's a raise hand button there, which you can then use to signal whether you want to ask a question. For our Chinese scholars who might be a little bit concerned that maybe their English isn't good enough to ask questions, you can put questions in the chat and I will then read them out and ask either Justine or Balamohan or both to respond in kind. So with that preamble made, do we have any questions? Please raise your hands or make yourself known. We'll give people a few seconds to do as they please. Maybe people are still thinking about how they want to formulate questions. So whilst people think about that, maybe Justine, you could give a response and then see how things go.
Yeah. So thank you, Balamohan. It's exactly right that my starting motivation, I do think of it as the witnessing of a wrong, or the witnessing of disrespect and the need to do something about that. And I'm very curious about whether there are any, so there must be, I'm just ignorant about this. Are there any cultures are there any places where the dynamic between cultures is not a settler colonial dynamic, and where issues arise about trying to understand? So if anyone in the audience kind of knows about this, I would be super interested in this. But just kind of provisionally, I do think the motivation for this project does clearly arise in a settler colonial context. There's a clear kind of power imbalance between the cultures in question. There are clear wrongs, epistemic wrongs, as well as other wrongs being done. And so that's why it seems particularly important to try to pursue, to find ways to pursue understanding. I still am curious about the question, supposing that wasn't there. I mean, so we don't now have that motivation, but still we might still want to be understanding the cultures that we're living alongside. And would that change what the right strategies were? I think that's an interesting question. It seems to me that although my motivation is the epistemic injustice motivation, that the strategies that it gives rise to might be applicable in other contexts as well. I liked some of the wording that you used, Balamohan. So I liked the phrase kind of to dwell in indigenous modes of existing and relating. I think you said that's very much something that I think I'm trying to find a way to do, and I don't know whether it's possible, but I hope that it's possible. Another thing you said early on about, I think, perhaps moving from talking about belief to moving to talking about interpretation and understanding. I think this is a shift that I've made through kind of working on this for a little while. So I began, and you can see it in the paper, Taking Taniwha Seriously. I began trying to give an argument that would make people believe in Taniwha. And then later I co-wrote a paper about intercultural understanding with a student of mine, and various of my colleagues. I don't think Jeremy Wyatt is here, but he kind of pushed me on the question, why do you keep talking about belief? Isn't what you're really interested in understanding? And I never have kind of made this fully explicit, I think, but I think that my talk of belief, or trying to find a way to believe, is there's an assumption there about how we can genuinely understand, or what it is to genuinely understand. Something like that genuine understanding involves entertaining the possibility that the thing the other person believes is true. Entertaining, and I mean, even better than entertaining the possibility of believing it would be to actually come to believe it. So what's missing in John Key's response to the question, you know, what do you think about Taniwha? What's missing is any thought that that Maori could actually be right, that there are Taniwha in the rivers and in the swamps, and that we should care about their location. It just doesn't even begin to think that that might be possible, I suppose. It's just kind of like other people believe this, but no serious attempt to engage. So I think there's some underlying thought that I have that I've not made fully explicit about how the way part of what it is to come to understand something is to get a feel for what it would be like to believe it, and perhaps even to come to believe it yourself. Yeah.
Balamohan, do you want to respond to that?
Kia ora. No, thank you. I do. I mean, it's just such an interesting conversation. I'm glad to have read you right in terms of that shift from going from the epistemic to the hermeneutics, because that shift seems to me such an interesting one, because it brings into view other types of priorities, and then it seems to kind of lessen some priorities. So one of the questions that I had written down, which seems now, in light of what you said, interesting to ask as well, the intertwining, I guess, of respect and belief on the one hand, and respect of understanding on the other hand. Like, I feel that there's a salient sort of difference between remedying disrespect by aiming at belief versus remedying disrespect by aiming at understanding.
Right.
Would you like to say a bit about that?
So I think that what I think is that you remedy disbelief by aiming at Yeah, definitely start by aiming at understanding, and then it might be that you get. Sorry, I'm slightly scrambled. So you aim at understanding. One possibility that I was just suggesting was a way to aim at understanding is to try to believe. That's a possibility. What's the relation of either of the things to respect? I never talked about what I meant by respect, but and I think that's important. So what is it? What is it to respect not just a person's right to hold a belief, but to respect the belief itself? I wonder if what it is to respect a belief is to entertain the possibility that it might be true, but I don't know of anything written on this. There's a paper by Robert Noller called "Religion is Owed No Respect" or something like that, in which he draws a distinction between respecting people's right to believe and respecting the content of the beliefs, and it's the kind of respecting the content of the beliefs which that I'm after, and that seems to me to be related to understanding. But I think all of this is quite kind of underspecified. Need to think about it more, and this discussion is being helpful for that. Yeah. There's a question in the chat, I think.
No, I don't think that is.
So there is one. It's just to me. So it says.
All right. Well, then.
So Zhang says, Kia Justine, thank you so much for speaking about your experiences and reflections. I had a thought about why a deep intercultural understanding beyond that of disengaged tolerance is important. I take the view that all people are inherently equal. From my experiences growing up in New Zealand as Kiwi Asian, the way we do things is very often the Western way of doing things. The Western way of doing things has been imposed on Maori throughout our history. Because of the power dynamic, Maori have been forced to adopt the Western way of doing things, while there is little in the way of Pākehā adopting the Maori way of doing things and being disengaged. By default, Pākehā have Western culture accepted and respected in New Zealand. Respecting the inherent value of all people, I think Maori should have the same right to have tikanga Maori fully accepted and respected, and in general, people should try to develop a deeper understanding of different cultures so that there is a deep intercultural respect for everyone. Thank you. That's a response to my saying I don't have much of an argument for why we should be trying to do this, and this is an argument. I'm cutting and pasting it into another document as I speak, so that I won't when we get out of here. I think that's right. So it's respecting people involves respecting the content of their beliefs and not just the fact that they hold those beliefs. That seems to me, that seems really important. Thank you. Did you, Jessie, you're here somewhere. Do you want to say more about this? No.
Thank you, Justine. That's all I had to say for now. But yeah, cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks. We can talk about this more another time.
Yeah. Actually, so I mean, I have a few small questions here. One is actually focusing on the thing that you said, Balamohan, about epistemic solidarity and whether that's a term. And I was thinking about that because when we talk about standpoint epistemology, presumably we think there's a certain amount of solidarity amongst people with particular epistemic standpoints that come from marginalized or oppressed positions. And so we would like to think, and I think this is the operative question here, which is this actually the case, that people who are part of marginalized groups, who have standpoints which give them special access to knowledge about their marginalization, should in theory be in solidarity with other similar groups. And actually would be interesting to go and see whether there's any work on this notion of epistemic solidarity from the marginalized, because of course there's another form of epistemic solidarity, and that's the epistemic solidarity of the oppressor. So you can have epistemic solidarity by majority groups, who all kind of share, say, in a Western context, coming from Western cultures with a kind of root belief system in the kind of scientific revolution associated with the Renaissance and things. So I think it's a really interesting operative question here as to how we cash out what epistemic solidarity is, and also whether it exists in kind of interesting structures amongst different groups of people with different standpoints.
That's such an interesting observation. I think one thing that came to mind is that solidarity as an ideal seems distinctively political. And here again, we're able to run that line of social, political, and epistemic hermeneutic being intertwined in this particular study in a complicated and interesting way. So simply, solidarity seems, an attitude characterizing people engaged in collective political action. And you're so right in terms of how that might exist from the dominant group as well. Like, I remember reading this excellent paper by Patrick Wolf, the settler colonial studies scholar, who was making the argument that actually some of the reason we should worry about multiculturalism is how various forms of narratives perpetuate a settler colonial logic, and yet now it's by migrant peoples. So the multicultural context creates conditions of solidarity amongst so-called model minorities, Pākehā, and so on. So that sort of idea, I think, of solidarity being a force amongst the dominant group, I think is really important and quite interesting.
Yes, I mean, actually...
I guess...
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that the reason I thought to kind of include solidarity in our discussions is that the witnessing of a wrong doesn't immediately tell us how to write it at the hermeneutic and epistemic level. So the disrespect and the mockery and ridicule that we might be observing, that epistemic injustice doesn't give us an insight into epistemic justice. And so the thought was that the remedying might require non-epistemically focused sort of things, even as we want to aim for more than tolerance, and even as we want to aim for intercultural understanding and facility to dwell in other manners of relating and reasoning. The idea is that those opportunities to develop the conceptual resources, the indigenous conceptual resource, might come about through solidarity-oriented, future-oriented sort of projects that are social and political in kind. And I think some of the suggestions on the way forward that you gave, Justine, seemed to me like that, which was what ways do we hold our activities such that it demonstrated solidarity in such a way that it allowed opportunities for the ground, developing the grounds, making more fertile, making more robust, these sorts of projects for us to then exist alongside.
So if I'm just thinking about what epistemic solidarity might be. I mean, so are you thinking, so there could be epistemic solidarity between different marginalized groups there, but am I displaying or trying to display epistemic solidarity by trying to come to understand a marginalized group, and then it's from that perspective it looks like a kind of like trying to be an ally, and perhaps it's up to the marginalized group to kind of confer that status or not confer it. You can't just kind of declare yourself an ally and be one, if you see what I mean.
My thought was that solidarity as a distinctly political ideal might require us to do things at the epistemic level, which seemed slightly different to saying epistemic, doing things at the epistemic level for solidarity. But I don't know, it's worth kind of thinking through it.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, because it gets us in kind of interesting question as to how do we motivate people to even be involved in this kind of resolution of the hermeneutics and the epistemics of what's going on here. And so, I mean, as a kind of personal aside, I mean, I grew up on the North Shore of Auckland in a very, very Pākehā environment. And I didn't think of myself as a particularly racist or, prejudiced person as a child. We learn Maori creation myths in school. That's sufficient to have an understanding of Te Ao Māori. And it really wasn't until I started dating someone who was Maori, and my current partner is Maori as well, that I came to realize that I thought I knew a lot about Maori and Te Ao Māori, but it wasn't until such time I was actually involved in family events with Māori that I actually went, I actually have no understanding of what's going on here. I mean, I know there are these words we use to describe things, but actually what they mean and why they do things they do. I mean, one of the great things is going onto the marae and having the discussion about who gets to speak on the marae, and the different power dynamics between the wharikai and the wharenui, and how everything kind of changes as you move from one part of the marae complex to another. And it really wasn't until I was immersed in the culture that I was going, oh, okay, knowing isn't actually sufficient. Knowing is not sufficient for understanding in these cultural contexts. And the worry, of course, is most people don't get to have that experience, and not necessarily by lack of trying, just by the size of the population of Pākehā and Tauiwi versus Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Most people are not going to be in that sense of being brought into Te Ao Māori. And that to my mind seems like such a pressing issue if we're concerned about how we're going to motivate people to go on these journeys. How do we get them on the journey by centering Maori in the story rather than Pākehā going, oh, I get to go on the marae now because that's the best way for me to find out what's going on.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. That's a real issue.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any questions from the chat? Or have we astounded them with our brilliance and they feel that they don't want to interrupt this conversation? Okay, well, maybe we could have some final thoughts by both our speaker and our respondent. So are there any final things you would like to say as a kind of mic dropping moment before you log off?
Thank you very, very much for the commentary, Balamohan, and thanks everyone for the questions. That they're very helpful. I think the relationship between the epistemic and the hermeneutic and the social, social political, that's something that I'm going to have to think about some more. So I've been thinking that the social political context that provides a motivation for this project, and witnessing wrongs that provides a motivation for this project. But that once the project's going, then those things are kind of off to the side, so that they kind of push me to get started. But now that I've got started, well, I guess it's still true that the social and political angle is playing a slightly unusual role at least in my original paper, in that you don't normally get an argument for believing something which includes the premise, it would be socially good if we all believed, if we all accepted this conclusion. That's normally a fallacious kind of form of argument, and I was trying to kind of motivate it in this particular case. So the social and political is still playing a role there. But once I started thinking in terms of understanding rather than in terms of belief, then I kind of thought that the social and political aspect drops out as part of the motivation. But now let's talk about strategies for achieving understanding. And this discussion, I think, has made me think it's all much more intertwined than that. So it's been very helpful to me. Thank you.
And Balamohan.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you so much, Em and Justine, for the invitation, because it's the first time I've had the privilege of offering a
No, okay, I have lost.
thought around are there instances and contexts where intercultural dialogues are between symmetrically, more or less, although positioned cultures, that's one worth really thinking through. And I wonder that might look like. I think a place as rich and diverse as the Indian context is surely going to throw up intercultural dialogue of that nature. So I'll think more on that and see if we can have a follow-up discussion, because I think that's really interesting.
Oh, thank you. You're muted, Em.
Yeah, so thank you both for an illuminating discussion. So before I do the announcement about the next talk, could we have a round of applause for our speaker and our respondent, please? Of course, some of the applause is simply behind mics. Our next talk and final talk for the semester is on December 5th at 6 p.m. China Standard Time, and that will be by Chris Renale from VU Amsterdam, and it's another piece on worldview. So in this case, it's a social epistemology of conspiracy worldviews, and I'll be the person giving the response in this particular case. So our final talk for the semester is in a month's time. Hopefully, I will see some of you there. For the Australasian contingent, unfortunately, that is at 11 o'clock night time in all over the North and South Island. But you are, of course, happy to join us if you're willing to stay up late on December the 5th. Otherwise, I will bring this meeting to a close. So once again, thank you to both Justine and Balamohan, and I hope to talk with you both in person very soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Kia ora, Em. Kia ora, Justine, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting us.
Good night, everyone.